12 full months had passed since the end of the Second World War, when Winston Churchill rose to deliver his reflections on the legacy of that titanic, epoch-shaping struggle. Across Europe, he said at Zurich University, there were, I quote, a vast quivering mass of tormented, hungry, careworn, and bewildered human beings who all wait in the ruins of their cities and homes and scan the dark horizons for the approach of some new form of tyranny or terror. Among the victors, there is a babel of voices. Among the vanquished, the sullen silence of despair. Even though Churchill is now often seen as an island-bound English nationalist, that speech saw him lay out a far wider vision. Europe, he said, and again I quote, was the home of all the great parent races of the Western world, the foundation of Christian faith and ethics, the origin of most of the culture, arts, philosophy, and science, both of ancient and modern times. And to recreate this great Europe, Churchill went on, there must be partnership between France and Germany. And then, he concluded, we must build a kind of United States of Europe. We live in times when the United Kingdom was led out of the European Union by leaders like former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, who claim to venerate Churchill. Farage sees American President Donald Trump as the new Churchill, and Boris Johnson actually wrote a book about him. Make what you will of this. Anyway, my main point is this. In 1950, as war broke out in the Koreas, Churchill sought to push a resolution through the newly created Council of Europe, asking for the immediate creation of a unified European army, subject to proper European democratic control and acting in full cooperation with the United States and Canada. The Council declined to create this European army, saying, rightly possibly, that it didn't have the power. That was Churchill who called for a European army, not some dyed-in-pink, pot-smoking liberal. Again, make of it what you will, but that's what happened. Hi, and thank you again for joining this week's episode of The Print Explorer, where we're going to be discussing new calls now being made for a European military. I thought about calling this episode Can Goldfish Bite along the lines of Can Pigs Fly, but that would have been rude, and I don't want to be rude. And honestly, for all I know, goldfish might have a really nasty bite. Europe has been set on fire this week by President Donald Trump, who seemed to revoke decades of American security guarantees to Europe. As the historian of contemporary Europe, Timothy Garton Ash writes, Trump has shown he not only bullies his country's friends, but sucks up to his country's enemies. Trump has suggested Russia can keep the Ukrainian territory it has captured. He's excluded Ukraine from ongoing talks with Russia. And according to the Daily Telegraph, he's demanded half of Ukraine's $11.5 billion reserves of rare earth minerals to pay back the military assistance it's received from the US. Where this $500 billion figure comes from, by the way, I cannot tell you, because the United States officially says it's given $69.2 billion to Ukraine since 2014, and even my credit card company doesn't charge that kind of interest. Anyway, all of this has set off an unprecedented wave of fear in European capitals. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has said he's willing to put British troops on the ground to enforce a peace deal along the Ukrainian-Russian border. France has said it's not yet willing to send combat troops to the front line, but has also said it wants to get Ukraine automatic membership of NATO in the event of Russian violation of a future ceasefire. That would presumably mean that it's going to be ready at some stage to commit French troops, since an attack on one NATO member is deemed an attack on all its members. European Union leaders are also bringing $6.2 billion to the table to sustain Ukraine's defense forces, which will in part compensate for the loss of US aid, but it's far from clear if they have the industrial base to deliver the material the country needs. Last year, the International Institute of Strategic Studies noted that while the EU produced some exquisite high-technology weaponry, its production rates for bread-and-butter items like tanks, artillery, and anti-submarine warfare aircraft were very low. There are plans in place to change all this, but factories don't get built from paper. The EU has estimated that to build a credible deterrent, its members need to spend $500 billion over the next 10 years. Voters battered by inflation and declining social services may not be thrilled by this idea. France is just hosting a European summit on these issues, and one of the ideas that's been rattling around the corridors of power is that there should be a European military to defend European military interests, even if the United States is no longer willing to guarantee the continent's security. Former Estonian Foreign Minister Urmas Paet, for example, has called for a kind of military Schengen zone, the common visa zone, where countries cede their defense responsibility to a common executive agency or council. Everyone, of course, doesn't agree with this idea. Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy head, says it needs 27 functioning militaries, one for each of its members, not just one military, which is another way of saying the status quo with American leadership of NATO can alone guarantee the continent's defense. Everyone, of course, knows what the bottom line is. Browan Maddox, the director of Chatham House, writes that Trump, and I quote, has fundamentally undermined European confidence in US commitment to NATO and to the principle of mutual defense. To hold the line, she says, France, the UK and Poland will all have to send troops into Ukraine and hope that the US continues to supply the missiles and aircraft that fuel the war effort. They'll also have to find enormous amounts of cash to underwrite this enterprise. This is much easier said than done, of course. In 2021, the expert David Axe reported that the United Kingdom would struggle to deploy a single brigade in sustained conventional warfare roles because of equipment shortages. The 3 Division of the British Army is the only UK force maintained continually at a state of war readiness, and credible testimony in 2020 suggested it could not defeat a peer adversary like Russia. This was, among other things, because of problems in its armored vehicle capabilities. France has done somewhat better. A 2021 study by Stephanie Pézard and her colleagues concluded the country has the resources to support the United States in a high-intensity war in Europe, but lacks the depth necessary to sustain a conflict over a long period. The German land forces, for their part, are tiny, with the capability to deploy a combat force of just 10,000 soldiers, only 4,000 of whom can be sustained over a long period. To understand how Europe got here, it's important to go back to that 1950 meeting where Churchill first made his proposals for a European military. There was no consensus, and given the hideous experience of 2 wars begun by Germany, there probably couldn't have been. The French leader André Philippe said he understood the danger to Europe from the Soviet Union, but saw it as less dangerous than reconstituting a German military. Leaders of the UK, for their part, argued that there could be no defense against Soviet power without Germany. Late in 1950, French Prime Minister René Pleven submitted a proposal inspired by Churchill, calling for a European Assembly with a European Minister of Defense, responsible to it and carrying out the directions of a Council of Ministers representing all the member states. In 1952, the Pleven Plan graduated into a treaty which envisaged a 43-division force being created. France would have contributed 14 of these divisions and 750 aircraft, Italy 12 divisions and 450 aircraft, the Benelux countries 5 divisions and 600 aircraft, and West Germany 12 divisions but no combat aircraft, which the rest of Europe at that stage didn't want to give them. This military would need political leadership, of course, and that was to come from an institution called the European Political Community. France, however, refused to ratify the creation of the European Political Community in 1954, seeing it as an unacceptable dilution of national sovereignty. And that pretty much killed the idea of a European military. Further problems erupted in 1953 when France and the United Kingdom joined Israel in attacking the Suez Canal after it was nationalized by the Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser. The United States was less than delighted by this Anglo-French operation. The French, for their part, were also less than pleased that NATO did not join it in defending its colonial territories in Algeria, unlike in Indochina, what is today Vietnam. Most important fact was, however, that the Europeans just could not agree on a way to defend themselves and to pay for it. Thus, from 1954, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, with America as its keystone, became pretty much the central institution of European defense. The agreement was tested in 1958 when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev gave a speech demanding that the Western powers, that is, the United States, Great Britain, and France, pull their forces out of West Berlin within 6 months. West Berlin was nestled deep inside East German territory, and a Soviet blockade would have cut it off from West Germany altogether. Earlier in 1948, the Soviet Union had sparked off a crisis in the city by cutting off land access between West Germany and West Berlin, which necessitated a year-long airlift of supplies. The Soviet argument was, and in a way correct, that after the war the four powers had promised to reunify the city. The Western powers, however, argued that conditions were not right for that. The crisis was diffused though, and both sides edged away from war. Khrushchev's 1958 threat, though, seemed set to have a less happy outcome. There were tensions over East Asia as well as over American U-2 spy flights over the Soviet Union. In response to Khrushchev's demands, President John F. Kennedy mobilized military reserves and increased defense expenditure, signaling willingness to go to war over Berlin. The Soviet Union responded by stringing a barbed wire fence across the city, which later became the Berlin Wall. There were several tense moments before secret diplomacy helped both sides back away from the edge. From declassified diplomatic documents, we now know some leaders in both the United States and Europe saw things in very different ways. French President Charles de Gaulle came away from the Berlin crisis convinced that his nation needed autonomy of action and the ability to defend itself. The two great powers, he believed, would be willing to sacrifice the interests of countries like France to insulate themselves from the horrific consequences of a nuclear war. The historian Toshihiko Aono has observed London and Washington also repeatedly disagreed on how the Berlin crisis should be handled. Later, in 1966, as a consequence of these disagreements and suspicions, France left NATO's integrated military command, though it remained a member of the organization. French staff today participate in NATO's military committee, its central decision-making body, but its troops are not under the multinational alliance's command. To understand the full implications of this European-American tension, we have to take a little detour into the very ugly world of nuclear weapons. Embedded in the rock more than 25 meters below the snow-dusted heart of Stockholm, the cavern's now an empty hall, sometimes hired out for concerts and exhibitions. 7 decades ago this summer, the hall became home to a nuclear reactor that silently produced weapons-grade plutonium, the heart of one of the world's most secret nuclear weapons programs. After Hiroshima, military experts had warned that the new kind of bomb dropped on the city would transform warfare. Workers' shovels soon began hitting frozen earth. The interesting thing is the hall wasn't under one of the Soviet Union's secret nuclear cities built by Joseph Stalin, who'd been told that the Americans were making a nuclear bomb, and it wasn't in the wastes of China's Lop Nor. It wasn't in the Fontenay aux Roses in Paris, where France had begun to breed plutonium, or run by the discreetly named tube alloys, the British nuclear weapons program. Largely forgotten today, the story of reactor R1 in Stockholm, the capital of social democratic free love and sandal Sweden, helps us understand the security dilemmas facing European countries after the Second World War. Would, as General de Gaulle put it, America really be willing to sacrifice New York for the sake of Paris? And what would happen if Germany became powerful again and attacked France or its other neighbors? These questions haunted European leaders in the wake of the Second World War, for all the warm talk about shared democratic values and civilizations. Efforts like the Swedish nuclear program had begun across Europe. The United Kingdom had made major contributions to kick-starting the American Manhattan Project. Leaders in the UK official history records expected that the US would return the favor by sharing the technology after the end of the Second World War. Fearing the technology would leak to the USSR, however, American President Harry Truman declined to give the British what they wanted. Furious British politicians ordered resources made available for the acquisition of an independent nuclear deterrent in 1946. "We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs," Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin told the cabinet committee in charge of the project. "We've got to have the bloody Union Jack flying on top of it." Across the English Channel, France was arriving at the same conclusion and for pretty much the same reason. The French government had acquired much of the world's heavy water supply in 1940 and moved it to the United Kingdom. Physicists Lew Kowarski and Hans von Halban later conducted experiments that proved fission, and thus nuclear weapons, was possible. Later in 1944, the French scientist Jules Guérin, one of the three involved in the Manhattan Project, gave leader-in-exile Charles de Gaulle a one-on-one secret briefing on the new weapons, nuclear policy expert Michael Schneider records. Even today, French nuclear forces remain completely outside NATO's structure. It's the ultimate deterrent. Trump's threats, as his former national security advisor John Bolton has noted, is starting to push American allies across the world to begin wondering how credible the superpower's security guarantees really are. Well, Bolton observed, if Trump is willing to knife NATO, what makes anybody think he wouldn't knife Israel if it suited his purposes? Look at European parties and you'll see lots of support for a European military architecture. French President Macron has backed the idea, and so did former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Almost all major German political parties had a reference to a European army in their election manifestos for the last federal election. For all the big talk about a European military, there are significant practical problems standing in the way of actually creating one. European scholar Ulrike Frank notes in a very thoughtful paper have 17 different types of battle tanks, each emerging from a national industrial base, while the United States has one. Where the USA has 6 important types of combat aircraft, Europe has 20. And even though the EU states combined have around 1.3 million soldiers under their command, every time there is a need to deploy forces, Europeans struggle to send and equip even small numbers. In the EU, there are 27 armed forces, 27 procurement authorities, and 27 defense industrial markets. The Europeans recognize this, and we've seen some incremental progress towards creating an autonomous military capability. The Europeans already have battle groups, which have theoretically been operational since 2007. These battle groups bring together several thousand soldiers who are supposed to be operational within 10 days of being given the command. The battle groups are provided by EU states on a rotational basis, but to this day they have never been deployed because EU member states could not agree on the circumstances in which to do so. The 2022 Strategic Compass published by the EU also proposes the establishment of an EU rapid deployment capability of up to 5,000 troops. 5,000 troops, though, are a tiny number. And then there's that eternal problem Trump never ceases to point out. 10 European NATO countries currently reach the target of 2% of gross domestic product for defense, which they committed to decades ago, while 18 do not. The United Kingdom is committed to reaching 2.5% of GDP for defense, but is shooting down all calls to raise that to 3% despite the deficits and the situation in Ukraine. Likely, Prime Minister Starmer believes, in my opinion correctly, that his voters mostly don't think the threat from Russia is large enough to justify cuts to social security or an already strained healthcare system. The European Union does have a defense clause, which was invoked for the first time in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks against France in November 2015. That action, though, was largely symbolic. There was no nation state attacking Europe at the time, which is probably why it could be taken. Ask European states today to prepare for a long war against Russia, and there'll probably be some embarrassed shuffling around the room. Like in the United States, there are serious debates in Europe over just what price is worth paying to contain Russia. Is it worth making concessions to Moscow in the interests of containing China? Or is that a chimera which will only feed President Vladimir Putin's ambitions? These are complex questions, and there's no easy answer. The problem goes far deeper, moreover, than mere calculations of geopolitics and collective security. The transatlantic alliance was founded on lived memories of 2 world wars, where the United States had to intervene to save Europe from itself. There were plenty of people in the United States, even in the build up to the Second World War, either with Nazi sympathies or who believed their country ought to leave Europe to its fate no matter the consequences. It's worth remembering that Trump's slogan, America First, was actually invented in the build up to the Second World War by Charles Lindbergh, the legendary aviator who was a leading proponent of staying out of Europe. As memories of those true savage wars fade, so is understanding of the toxic nationalisms and racism which drove Europe to war, as well as a cognizance of what the price of misjudging geopolitics in an interconnected world can be. Europeans are trying to insulate themselves and create a backbone to protect the alliance they've built. They're very far, however, from actually having the muscle to be able to protect themselves. And Trump's made clear that time is not on their side. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.